Florida broke its opening day record for in-person early voting this week with over 350,000 people casting ballots on that day. Democrats and Republicans have boosted efforts in this crucial swing state, with Democrats pushing mail-in voting and Republicans hoping to see a huge voter turnout in person. Political reporter with The Hill and our colleague Julie Manchester has been closely following the race in Florida and is here to discuss where exactly the campaigns are and what to make of these numbers. So great to see you, Julia.
Good to see you too, Crystal.
All right, so what do we know about the early vote so far, and what should we make of it?
Well, we know that early voting numbers in Florida have broken records. I mean, we saw just Monday morning, essentially, these long lines and, torrential thunderstorms even in major counties like Miami-Dade County, Orange County, Seminole County, just a large amount of voters turning out to vote early in person. And this is remarkable because we know that Florida has been a hotspot for the coronavirus pandemic, and now cases are going up. But we're seeing, despite mail-in efforts, voters still want to vote in person. Florida is also interesting in that you're not only seeing Democrats pushing the early vote, but you're also seeing Republicans push the early in-person vote. And I was just actually looking at some data, and it shows that slightly more Republicans have turned out to vote over Democrats in that state. Now, that's in-person voting. That's not counting the mail-in balloting, which Democrats tend to take part in more than Republicans. But Florida's an important state, 29 electoral votes up for grabs. It's a swing state, so it's definitely a state we'll be watching for the next 2 weeks leading up to Election Day.
And what are analysts projecting? All the analysts that I'm reading are saying, be really careful what you make of these early voter numbers. First of all, it's a crazy year, unlike anything we've seen before. Second of all, we know Democrats are more likely to vote early. Maybe, in person, you say it's more or less tied Democrat and Republican, but mail-in ballots have been overwhelmingly Democratic. The expectation is that Election Day will be overwhelmingly Republican. What are Florida-specific analysts saying about what turnout is likely to look like? And is there anything that we can read into this data so far about the partisan breakdown and what that might imply?
Well, like you said, Crystal, they're being very, very cautious. It's hard to make predictions just off of the early mail-in vote and early in-person vote, because we know that still on Election Day, there is likely to be a record number of people, not just in Florida, but across the country, headed to the polls. So that's definitely something to keep an eye out for. But Florida is interesting because we see that 34%, or roughly 34% of the voting age population in Florida are senior citizens. Now, we know that senior citizens tend to vote Republican or lean conservative. However, compared to 2016, we're seeing President Trump very much falling behind in his support among senior citizen age voters. And Joe Biden is actually doing very well with that group. However, Trump is still leading. We saw Joe Biden speaking to a group of senior citizens at an event in Pembroke Pines in South Florida last week. So we clearly see that he's making a play for that vote. But, I bring up senior citizens because they're one of the most reliable voting groups in Florida and really across the country. And, while during coronavirus, we would assume that they would want to vote by mail because they're obviously could be a more at-risk population, we still see that they're coming out and voting in person. We saw it at the primaries, and we're seeing it in early voting. So I would say that population in particular is a population to watch in Florida because we know that they're reliable. They make up a big chunk of the population, and they could really swing either way.
And what about Latinos? Because Joe Biden seems to have gained versus 2016 in terms of seniors, and that's not just in Florida, but we see that in polling across the country. Surprisingly, I think to many, President Trump seems to have gained some over his 2016 numbers among Latinos. And that seems to be particularly the case in the state of Florida, where you have, a large Cuban population that traditionally does lean Republican to start with. But what are you seeing in those numbers, and what's the importance of that? What are the dynamics there?
You're absolutely right. President Trump is doing better than I think many people expected with the Latino population, specifically in Florida. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that in South Florida, you have the Cuban American population, and Cuban Americans tend to, particularly older Cuban Americans, tend to vote more conservatively. And we see that President Trump did relatively well with this particular demographic in 2016. So you have to keep that in mind. But you also have the President Trump and Republicans messaging on the matter that could be helping them with this Cuban American or even Venezuelan population in Florida. They keep on pushing this messaging that Democrats are socialists. They're trying to almost tie this, so-called socialist messaging to, dictatorships and other, political systems that may have come from Latin America before this population emigrated here. So you're hearing that a lot from President Trump and Republicans, and it seems to be resonating with the older members of the, Venezuelan and Cuban American population. However, I would say that there are also segments of the Latin American population in Florida that aren't necessarily going to be more conservative. For example, where I'm from, Central Florida, you have a large Puerto Rican population. And Puerto Ricans, on average, in Central Florida, tend to be very Democratic, and they tend to vote Democratic. So I think the important thing to remember when we look at the Latino population in Florida and across the country is that they are in no way a monolith. They vote very differently, whether that's generationally or in terms of their original nationality. I think that's something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And finally, Julia, a lot of people are paying extra close attention to Florida because it's one of the states that can count mail-in ballots early. And usually gets there. I know they have a bad election rap, a well-deserved bad election rap, but they usually get their results in relatively early. This is a state that President Trump basically has to win. So Michael Bloomberg, for example, has been spending a lot of money in the state of Florida to try to make sure that we know on election night if Joe Biden is in fact the next president of the United States. Take us through some of those dynamics. What are some of the unique laws and regulations? When do you think people will know who has ultimately won Florida on election night?
Well, I think Florida is going to play a big role, like you said, because a lot of the ballots get counted early. So that's something to keep in mind. And then you're also going to be seeing the in-person turnout, whether it's before Election Day or on Election Day. So I think it depends on how many people turn out in person before and, during Election Day. But I think those mail-in ballots are going to play a critical role in figuring out who won Florida, because if we see either Biden or Trump win Florida, they are probably, depending on how they're doing across the country, they could definitely have an automatic leg up. Personally, I don't think we are going to know who the president is on election night. I could be wrong, but that's just my prediction right now. However, whoever wins Florida, because of that early mail-in voting counting, I think that's going to give them a leg up as we go into the days after Election Day.
Julia, thanks so much for breaking this all down for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.